Hi, Amaze. This is Dr. Deirdre McLaughlin joining you with the next of our SIP skills sessions. Today, we're going to be talking all about methods and methodologies, probably one of the most requested sessions in terms of SIP prep. So just a few reminders before we dive in. First, these SIP skills sessions are not meant to replace your supervision. They're an opportunity for you to refine your research skills, to get a little more confident before you complete your research proposal, and to maybe do a refresher when you're inside the SIP process. They focus on research skills and ways of researching instead of your specific content, because that's what you'll most likely cover in your one-to-one supervisions with your supervisor. These sessions aren't to be shared or edited or copied in any way. And finally, each lesson has corresponding activities or handouts or videos that work alongside it to support your learning. So I really encourage you to look at Brightspace to engage with those materials. It will make everything hopefully a bit more engaging. There'll be tasks you can do that shouldn't take too much time. It'll help get your confidence up. So here we go. Let's start with methods and methodologies. What are they and what's the difference? Well, that's really the big question that students need to be asking. I will say though, if you've passed the performing research unit, you've probably engaged with methods and methodologies, because having a research methodology and undertaking research methods are key components of that assessment. So if you've done that unit, you have worked with a method and a methodology. Hopefully you knew what it was. Sometimes students don't necessarily, or they're finding that someone else in their group might be leading or helping them, or their tutor, and that is okay. In that initial instance, we want to have a bit more control on it now that you're working independently. I think in that regard, methods and methodologies, it's a bit like learning how to ride a bike for the first time. Someone's cheering you on and telling you to sit there and pedal, and you just sort of roll with it, and hopefully you don't fall, although normally there's a few rounds of that. But you don't know what you're doing. You probably couldn't teach someone else to ride a bike until you really knew how. So methods and methodologies take a little bit of trying and practice, which you will certainly have had at least last term. And now it's time for us to start to try them out on our own. So let's look at some comprehensive definitions of these two different things, and then we can understand how and why you would use them in your research process. So research methods, let's look at those first. These are usually the things that people think about when they're thinking about research or research design. The word research design, how your research is organized, is often when we talk about methods and methodologies. Research methods are tools. They're a component of information and data collection. So if you have information, if you have data, that could be key terms, that could be observations, that could be sources of knowledge, that usually comes from your research methods. So here's some examples of popular research methods. Working in the humanities, usually a literature survey is a key part of any research project. It will likely be, whether you do a traditional literature review or not, you're going to have to do some reading to define your terms and start off. You may see things like observation, participant by you or participants, surveys, interviews, strategic focus groups. You might do experiments. You could do them independently. You could look at existing experiments. Case studies. Now we'll come back to this again. Most writing assignments in the first term require students to take a critical idea and look at it with two really focused examples of practice. And in that sense, those one or two examples of practice usually qualify as being a case study in the method sense. But we'll talk about case studies again in methodology, because they can function in both. It can be a little confusing. You might be looking at secondary data, so you might be looking at someone else's data, looking at an archival study in a new way. Usually there's mixed methods, which means there's some combination of a few of these. I would say 2, 3, great. If you're thinking 5, 6, it's probably too much. That's too much data to collect and too much data to get to talk to each other. So you really want to put some thinking into which research methods are right for your project. So selecting your research methods. First, the amount of time you have for data collection and analysis is really important to consider. So how much time do you have to gather information informs what different ways you want to gather it. Plus, after you gather that information, you're not done. You need to analyze it. You need to break it down critically. So for example, an observation or an interview method helps collect richer information, but it takes time. You need to plan the interview. You need to ask people to participate. You need to undertake the interview and potentially transcribe part or all of it. Converse with that person to get consent. Those things are time consuming. They can be really valuable and have lots of good information, but you don't want to overextend yourself. A survey may help you connect with many people far more quickly, but usually surveys have shorter answers. If you want to, I don't know if you've ever filled out a survey where people can ask you to answer long questions. Most people don't like that. They like short, concise, a few words, and that's how you'll get the most out of someone participating in a survey. So thinking about the strengths and weaknesses that different data collection tools offer you, how these different methods can give you different type of information. Do you need to talk to more participants? Do you need to talk to a few key people in lots of detail? What is most useful when thinking about your overall question? Move this video to the side. I hope you can see this clearly. So what's the difference? And that last slide brings up a really important question. In fact, I'm going to bring us back there for a second. So the types of data you collect. Yeah. This is a good opportunity to take a pause and talk about two different types of data or research, because we can use these words in the context of collecting information with methods or an overall research design, which may be informed by our methodology. And that's qualitative and quantitative research. So qualitative research is primarily exploratory research. It's good for understanding questions and opinions, if someone's motivated to do something, the experience of something, and what ideas or processes might underlie it. Hopefully, qualitative research will provide insight into a question and a hypothesis that might have some results, but it's usually not a black and white answer. Quantitative research is used to quantify a problem and its answers using numerical measurable data. So it's often collected and transformed into statistics. It can help quantify, so measure attitudes, opinions, behaviors, and other variables. So qualitative is about the quality of something, what it's like to, and describing. Quantitative is measuring and looking at how much. Generally, at Central, we tend to see more qualitative research than quantitative. That's not to say you can't engage with both. It just takes a lot of time and resources to do a quantitative study. You may draw on someone else's quantitative data. You may choose to undertake some elements of quantitative data and some elements of qualitative. But it's important to keep that in mind. And this is because for those of us who've been in previous education systems, when you're not working in a humanities department, quantitative data can be framed as the more scientific or the more rigorous form of data. And to be honest, that's quite a dated outlook. That's really simply not true. At the end of the day, when it comes to analyzing quantitative data for any complex questions, qualitative analysis always comes in, because the way we collect, or rather the way we measure things, which is quantitative, is often informed by personal bias. Choices that we make around how those measurements will work are informed by attitudes and opinions. And so there's always an element of quality going on, or almost always. I don't really like definitive black and whites, but almost always. So don't be afraid if you're undertaking purely qualitative research, but it's good to know if you're mixing those two things or what the two different things are. All right. You may even find it useful in your research proposal to identify, I believe this will be a qualitative research study, or I believe it will be quantitative, or I believe I'll be mixing the two in this selection of methods. So Now we're going to move on to research methodologies, the one that gets very tricky for everyone. So your methods are your ways of gathering information. Your methodology is the overarching design that brings everything together. It's the justification you use for why you've selected the research methods you have. They should be working within your methodology. Sometimes methodologies are called our way of knowing, but another way to think about it is that it's like a lens. In fact, I'm going to hold up a pair of sunglasses right now. It's like a lens through which you look at all the information that you gather. And when you're undertaking your analysis, you see it all through this lens. So depending on the type of methodology that you have, it might be explained right off the bat in your instruction. It might come in chapter 1 or chapter 2, because by the time you get to the critical analysis where you're bringing terms and ideas together, you probably have some type of research design element that you're using to look at that information, to look at what you've gathered with your research methods and how are you bringing them all together. That lens is your methodology. So here is a large list of examples of research methodologies that have been used on postgraduate dissertations at Central in recent years. This is far from a complete list, but it's just to show you that there's so many different perspectives out there. So here's a handful. I've got action research and grounded theory, practice as research. Sometimes it can be practice-based research or practice-led research, although Central has quite a long history engaging with practice as research. Phenomenological research, ethnographic, autoethnographic, feminist, queer, critical race theories might be applied, constructivism, a narrative inquiry, historical research, and I'll come to case studies in a moment. The key is there are so many different potential methodologies, and within that, there's different approaches to how to undertake them. So sometimes students know right off the bat what their methodology is, and that's because they've experienced it somewhere else, or they read another dissertation or journal article that stated what their methodology was, and it felt really right and really clear. If that's the case for you, that's wonderful. Include it in your research proposal, and you'll certainly get some feedback about your selection. Now, what happens with the majority of students is they're not feeling so confident and maybe they choose to revisit the methodology from their performing research presentation, or they come to their supervisor and say, I'm not quite sure. That's all right too. As a supervisor, when a student comes to me and they have a sense of their topic and what literature they might be engaging with, and maybe a sense of 2 or 3 methods of collection they might be interested in, usually within the first to the second tutorial, we can figure out together what the best methodology for them might be. If you come into a first tutorial and say, I don't know what my methodology is, can you tell me? You might get an answer from your supervisor, but what's more likely is that they'll ask you a bit more about what reading you're doing and what you think about it and how you'd like to bring things together. This is because if you look at this big list of methodologies, there are so many research questions where you could pick anything off this list and it would be right. There is no real right or wrong answer. It's a bit like if I were to take you grocery shopping and our information, our data was all the ingredients, yes? So we've picked up tofu and we've picked up broccoli and we've picked up soy sauce and we've picked up red peppers, all these different ways of having things or information. Our methodology is how we bring it all together. Let's say it's our cooking process. So I could grill them, I could stir fry them, I could bake them, and any way would be delicious. And so to play with that metaphor, any preparation could be valid. It's not about getting it right, it's about picking the way of working that's the best fit for you and your research. So that's part of why when students pull out a book or read a giant article on what is methodologies, they sometimes get caught up in methods and thinking they're the same thing, or they read through examples of all these different methodologies and go, oh, but it could be any of them, I don't understand. It could be any of them. And it's really takes a little practice of you articulating your opinions and looking at examples of other people's methodologies and talking to your supervisor to help you find the right one for you. Breathe, trust, and communicate, and I'm very confident you'll find the right methodology. If you have one final note, if you have a study group that you're working with, an activity that I often give my MA students when we're working together in class is I will put all of these different methodologies in a hat. I'll have everyone pick one and say, okay, by next week or the next day, you need to be able to present 2 to 3 minutes on what this is. Rough and ready, messy and quick, just explain it to other people with as much false confidence as you've got. What is this in 2 minutes? I think that could be a great activity. If you do it alone, it might be a little overwhelming. But if you've got a big group or even a medium-sized group to work with and you each pick a couple and take some time explaining them to each other, it might help you realize, ooh, this one's really good for me. You'll also notice that in the same way people mix methods, sometimes they blend methodologies. Talk to your supervisor about it. It absolutely can be done, but making sure it's done with clarity so that they're both become part of the analysis. It's a bit like wearing a couple of different sunglasses. You got to be able to balance them, and that can be done, but it needs to be done thoughtfully. So how do you select your research methodology? We know what they are, but how do you pick one? Whoop, I just moved the slide ahead. So the type of research that you're undertaking, as I said a little bit earlier, should dictate the right research methodologies that underpin your research and data collection. And it might be worthwhile in these early stages to discuss this with your course leader or your unit tutor for your SIP while you're developing your proposal. If you are able to articulate, this is what my question might be, these are some sources I want to engage with, this is the type of reading I'm confident with, or the way of collecting materials I'm most interested in, then it's possible that they might be able to give you some feedback at the proposal stage. If it's not, just let your supervisor know in the first meeting. If you're torn between a few, let them know, but also if you're really unsure, ask them if they might be able to give you 2 or 3 suggestions at your first supervision that you might go look into yourself and decide which one is the right fit. Sometimes that can be a really nice way forward to go, well, if you do a case study, it will look like this. If you do a phenomenological approach, it will look like this. And if you do an autoethnographic study, it will look like this. All different ways of engaging with your research materials. So I hope this session helped cover a little bit and increase your confidence on the difference between research methods and research methodologies. Just to recap, research methods are ways of collecting data and information, of finding that data that we need, the definitions of key terms, the stories from people we're interviewing, all of the information we're going to bring together. And then the way we bring that information together, the way we analyze it and get critical with it beyond description, that should be the root of our methodology. The methodology is very much the spine of your work because it influences a lot of the choices you make. So it takes a little bit of time for that to get strong, but when it's there, everything else should hold up around it. Be sure to look at the practical exercises that go along with this lesson on Brightspace, and I'll see you next time.